Good evening and welcome to The World Today. We're going to discuss the situation in Zimbabwe, where some months ago there was quite a unique event of the military intervening to remove a leader who had got too accustomed to power.
Fellow Zimbabweans, we wish to make it abundantly clear that this is not a military takeover of government.
And was seeing himself as a life president. And his removal triggered a whole wave of celebrations and public demonstrations in the country where the opposition had effectively been crushed. And Robert Mugabe's removal from power in this humiliating fashion, he was not executed, leave alone imprisoned, he is still free, lives in the country, which is another innovation, if one can put it like that. But there's no doubt that his removal by the military was viewed as an extremely popular event in the country itself, and to a certain extent in the region. To discuss all this, we have in the studio Simukai Chigudu, who teaches development studies in Oxford University in Britain, who has just returned from the country and is with us today. Simukai, welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Tell me, you've just returned. The initial euphoria that I described was there.
The way I would characterize the mood in Zimbabwe is very schizophrenic. It's split. When I arrived in Zimbabwe in early December, so only a matter of maybe 2-3 weeks after the events that you've described, I was greeted at immigration actually with jubilation. The immigration officer who saw me at the desk asked if I had brought champagne to celebrate over this Christmas. This was unprecedented. Normally, bureaucrats, civil servants, ordinary Zimbabweans shy away from discussing politics openly. So it was very evident to me that this was on the forefront of people's minds. As I went through Harare, the streets had been cleared of the police, and there was a general atmosphere of excitement and anticipation within the country over this new political moment.
And everyone discussing politics.
Yes. Having said that, the moment conversation started to get a little bit deeper, it became apparent that there were quite important fissures in political opinion. A number of people expressing, as I've suggested, anticipation and optimism were balanced out by a host of other people expressing extreme trepidation over what was happening, or else cynicism that this was merely old wine in new bottles, that the transition that has happened is the removal of a tyrant, not a tyranny.
Simukai, one of the charges made against Mugabe and the general perception, both in the country and outside, was not so much related to him because people knew he was an old man and sooner or later the laws of biology would move in, but related more to his wife, Grace Mugabe, who had political ambitions, who had a faction in the ZANU-PF, and people were worried that what they were witnessing or what could happen was a dynastic situation in the country where she would actually take over with the support of the bureaucracy and the military, shunting aside most of the other people who were in line, waiting, and had been queuing up a long time to occupy this position. How would you assess that?
I'm going to start by talking about the character of Grace Mugabe to begin with. Grace Mugabe kind of is, of course, Mugabe's wife. She's 41 years his junior. She was his former secretary. And in the early to mid-90s, after an affair that took place while Mugabe was married to his now previous and late wife, Sally Mugabe, she was a relatively quiet player on the political scene, executing the duties of First Lady as expected. However, this tone began to change most markedly about 4 years ago. Around this time, Grace Mugabe started to appear more frequently at political rallies, became a very vocal, not only supporter of Mugabe, but increasingly started to put forward her opinions about what needed to happen in the succession of Mugabe, which we all knew was inevitable. Her first kind of major act within politics, I would say, was engineering or participating in the removal of the then senior vice president Joyce Mujuru in December 2014. Since then, she has taken Zimbabwean politics by storm, appearing at myriad rallies and conferences, publicly lambasting other politicians, and garnering tremendous support around her within a faction of the ruling ZANU-PF party, as you've suggested, the so-called Generation of 40 or G40. Now, I think that the charges against her are manifold. On one level, there was the issue of dynasty. That it appeared very much that Mugabe in his advanced age was wielding considerable power to his wife, that it looked increasingly likely that not only had she removed Joyce Mujuru, but was going to move in on the other vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and solidify her space as a potential successor to Robert Mugabe. So that was one issue. The other issue was Grace's own unpopularity within Zimbabwe more widely. She had garnered for herself a number of negative nicknames, Gucci Grace, Disgrace, for her lavish spending and so-called uncouth behavior. Undoubtedly, there was a strong patriarchal element to all of this, that being a woman in politics, whether you conduct yourself with decorum or whether you're crass like Grace, is a very difficult position to occupy.
Even though Grace had been ruthless in removing Joyce.
Absolutely.
From as a vice president, seeing her as a potential rival.
Yes, and the manner in which Joyce was removed, many of the accusations made against her related to things like witchcraft accusations, promiscuity. These are highly gendered narratives. Certainly the faction that had moved in against Grace Mugabe had a series of grievances against her, a real fear of a Mugabe dynasty, a real fear of a woman in politics, and a real fear of somebody as unpopular and as ostentatiously corrupt taking over the country.
Give me an account of the current acting president or president who has promised in public that the 2018 elections to be held in Zimbabwe will be fair and free and anyone can take part, etc. Two things. One, his own background. I mean, his nickname is Crocodile. He was a key player in the liberation struggle, yes, has been with Robert Mugabe for virtually all his political life, clearly was dismissed from government as a result of pressures from Grace and her circle. But what is he like himself?
Emmerson Mnangagwa certainly has been a key player in ZANU-PF, was a key player in the liberation struggle, and has been a member of Zimbabwe's security apparatus in one form or another, as well as its higher echelons of government since independence in 1980. His record, if we are to be even-handed, I think is very checkered and gives us strong reason to be a bit circumspect, both about his promises, particularly with respect to political pluralism and the space for opposition politics. I think his critics would hasten to point out that in the 1980s, he was a Minister of State Security during a time when ZANU-PF was really trying to shore up its political hegemony.
Is that the time when Joshua Nkomo and his party were wiped out, more or less? I mean, not wiped out politically, which they were, but there were massacres that took place in Matabeleland.
Yeah, that's correct. The Zimbabwe liberation struggle, to sort of characterize a very complex conflict into more simple terms, was really divided on three major cleavages. On one hand, you had the very right-wing Rhodesian colonialist state under the Rhodesian Front fighting to retain white minority rule.
Once upon a time, Prime Minister, you said you would never see black rule in this country in your lifetime. Do you still stand by that?
Yes, I believe that that was a fair comment, and I think that if we ever got to a stage of having black rule, then I think our policy would have failed.
On the other, you had two nationalist movements. You had the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe, of which Emmerson Mnangagwa was a part. Then you had the Zimbabwe African People's Union, led by Joshua Nkomo. Now, ZANU and ZAPU more or less formed their coalitions roughly along geographic and ethnic lines, although there were primarily political reasons for doing so. ZANU has come to be associated with the Shona-speaking parts of the country, which make up the majority of Zimbabwe, and ZAPU with the Ndebele-speaking parts. This led to a series of conflicts between former combatants and new sectors of the security apparatus. And it culminated most notoriously over the period of about 1981 to 1987 over a series of massacres that took part in Matabeleland. These are the primarily Ndebele-speaking portions of the country.
Nkomo's base.
Nkomo's base, exactly. Robert Mugabe mobilized a part of the army, a unit called the 5th Brigade, to put down and to kill so-called dissidents within Matabeleland. These were people who were former ex-combatants that had fought for ZAPU, who were seen to be threatening ZANU's rule and political dominance. Mnangagwa played an instrumental role in helping to coordinate this violence and these attacks, which were executed not only against ex-combatants, but also against many civilians.
Given this record, it doesn't sound as if we're going to move in a very progressive or democratic direction.
Certainly a number of people, and this is evident on social media as well as popular debate within Zimbabwe, are talking about some kind of reckoning over this period of massacres that in Zimbabwe are widely referred to as Gukurahundi. This is a Shona term that translates loosely as the rain that washes the chaff away after the harvest. And it refers to the fact that the Ndebele people saw themselves as the chaff that was being washed away. There is another very important reality in Zimbabwe at play, which is Zimbabwe's dire economic situation. At the moment, unemployment is estimated at somewhere in the region of 80% within the country. There is a severe liquidity crisis where there's hardly any money circulating within the country, which makes it extremely hard to pay people, as many people need to pay for school fees, healthcare bills, and so forth within cash, and many people are in informal work. So without liquidity, much economic life comes to a halt. These are the kinds of issues that Mnangagwa has been speaking very directly to. He has bold and ambitious plans for bringing in new investment into the country from old partners like the British, as well as new partnerships with the Chinese and with South Africa. He has talked about eliminating corruption within the public sector. He's introducing a number of austerity measures, including the trimming down of cabinet members and so forth. And he's speaking a language of a certain kind of economic populism that I think is going to shore up tremendous support. And I think that for many people, these priorities supersede dealing with what has gone on in the past. That yes, maybe a time for a public reckoning will arrive, but right now we have to deal with the very material reality of getting people into employment and allowing people to eat.
Explain one thing to me. There was, some years ago, an incredible campaign against Mugabe in the Western media,
yes,
especially after he took the land back from some white farmers and it was redistributed, which many felt should have been done immediately after independence in any case, but was not done. And that created a big campaign against him certainly in the British media, but also in the American media. And this campaign reached a peak, and then suddenly it disappeared, and Zimbabwe was not on the pages of the Western media at all. What was taking place? Why did this happen?
So I think that a little bit of historical context would help in answering that question. We can broadly characterize Zimbabwe's post-colonial trajectory, I think, into three kind of phases. So in the 1980s, when the new government came into power, Despite the violence that we've already talked about and the discontent, the government did in fact make tremendous progress in terms of improving the situation from what the Rhodesians had left behind. They massively expanded education and healthcare to the black majority, and there was in fact, contrary to popular belief, an incredible land restitution program put into place throughout the 1980s, and many poor and land-hungry people managed to get access to land. Nevertheless, the agricultural sector was one of the major components of the Zimbabwean economy, and a lot of the most viable large-scale commercial land was used by white farmers. Over the 80s and the 90s, the economy under ZANU-PF had largely been predicated on redistribution as opposed to production. And it had also inherited debt from its Rhodesian predecessor, and then wider global factors like the oil crisis and the global debt crisis and so forth essentially crippled the economy in terms of its vast amounts of public spending on the kinds of issues that I've already highlighted. The government, in response to this, decided to implement an economic structural adjustment program as sort of directed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
What year was that?
This began around 1991. Now, over the 1990s, ZANU-PF's popular legitimacy suffered tremendously.
Because of this?
Because of this. So we had a situation where a highly popular, very efficient, very powerful bureaucratic state in the 1980s had been crippled by its own economic mismanagement, its corruption scandals, and its kind of shrinking of the public sector in the decade that followed. And then in 1999, as a new opposition emerged, the Movement for Democratic Change, formed largely by a combination of white industrialists and capitalists, as well as trade unions and urban youth, began to garner support. It became apparent to ZANU-PF that its monopoly of the political scene was no longer viable. And it lost a referendum to change the constitution in 2000, followed subsequently by a real electoral challenge in parliamentary and then presidential elections in 2000 and 2002. Now, this history is important because it informs the fast-track land reform program that occurred in Zimbabwe between 2000 and 2003. On one hand, there was certainly a lot more land redistribution that needed to happen that had not fully been implemented through the 1980s for a host of factors that we can discuss later. And so over this period, we saw a highly authoritarian populist move to reclaim the land, couched within a rhetoric of an ongoing liberation struggle and targeted against a skewed racialized economy, certainly, but in the process, one that destroyed our commercial agricultural sector and precipitated the deindustrialization that proceeded apace in the country from 2000 onwards. So all of this to say that land reform was embedded within a set of historical processes as well as political exigencies on the part of Robert Mugabe's attempt to keep ZANU-PF and keep himself within power. This then fed into, and the kind of racial character of all of this, you know, the taking of farm from white farmers, fed into a popular campaign by the British press against Robert Mugabe. A lot of the language, a lot of the ideas that animated that campaign were ahistorical and were quite frankly racist and colonialist. They fed into an undue sympathy towards the white farmers, a misreading of the dynamics of poverty and inequality in Zimbabwean society, such that we ended up with a very divided and in fact internecine portrayal of Zimbabwe's struggle, where on the one hand you had a British press calling Mugabe a tyrant seizing land for his own interest. Then you had Mugabe reappropriating those very same discourses and saying that all of Zimbabwe's problems emanated for Britain's ongoing colonial lust.
The high degree of unemployment, I mean 80% is a just incredible figure, almost inconceivable, must mean that there's been a lot of emigration, or people who can get away to find jobs in neighboring countries. The most famous example of this, of course, is the story, the narrative of a decade ago, when lots of Zimbabwean migrant workers went to South Africa and were actually attacked by South Africans who were unemployed as well, not that that justifies anything, yes. Who went to attack these Zimbabwean workers, migrant workers, singing songs from the South African liberation struggle.
The figures around Zimbabweans' emigration from the country are staggering. From 2000 onwards, I mean, across the board, the private sector, the public sector, civil society, the rural poor, you saw so many Zimbabweans leaving the country, many of whom entering into barter trade, informal sector work in neighboring countries. Of course, there's a very large, amongst the middle classes, a very large Zimbabwean diaspora in the UK, in Australia, in parts of the US and Canada. I mean, there are running jokes that if you went to Iceland, you would find a Zimbabwean. And while, of course, we talk about 80% unemployment, that's in a very formal sense. Many people continue to hustle. They continue to work in the informal sector. Now, in terms of the violence that has been faced within South Africa, I think that this is a story that we see in a sense worldwide, where we see the forces of economic globalization leaving many people poor and unemployed, particularly in urban areas, and we see a politics of pitting the poor against each other. So South Africa's own story of inequality.
It's horrific.
Absolutely. And bearing in mind, of course, that South Africa, competes with countries like Brazil for the dubious honor of being the most unequal society in the world. And so we have this very unfortunate situation where global processes intersect with nationalist politics, the harsh realities of economic inequality, and then that boil down to terrible conflict as poor people scramble with and fight each other for the dregs of the economy. And I think that's a very important part of the story of what's happening within South Africa.
Simukai, there's another side to all this, which is that the model many post-colonial states chose in Africa was an economic model of state intervention to create, which is perfectly understandable. But the political side of it was the one-party state, authoritarian rulers, wanting to be presidents for life. And then we had the example of Tanzania, where Julius Nyerere, did quite a lot for the country, the Arusha Declaration, but then retired himself from politics and said other people should run the country. And that I've always felt from that time onwards. I mean, I remember talking to Nyerere about this, and he said to me, dynasties are a South Asian disease. He said, look, you have them in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. This we've avoided in Africa. But Zimbabwe shows it hasn't been avoided. I mean, it's been stopped, but with force. But why is the Tanzanian example of leaders just leaving politics gently and calmly and allowing others, why hasn't that been more generalized?
I think at least part of the reason that we see these dynamics emerging emanate from the circumstances in which many African countries came into being, as independent entities. Many countries entered the community of nation states having inherited borders that bear no resemblance to any coherent political community. In a world divided by Cold War tensions and very contrasting ways of organizing economy and society, and with Cold War rivalries often playing themselves out via hot wars within Africa itself. And so to some extent, without wishing to excuse any modes of violence or coercion, I think that many post-colonial leaders in Africa were faced with tough choices. How do you keep these new polities together? How do you forge an identity that people can share in? Should the notion of a new nation supersede previous ethnic or regional divisions? To what extent does one use the coercive apparatus of the state to bring about economic productivity and try to improve the material circumstances before one thinks about political pluralism? These dilemmas plagued the African continent throughout. And certainly, as you point out, Nyerere's Tanzania is an unusual example in terms of a prominent leader kind of stepping away from power. In Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe has also been plagued by some of these dynamics. I think it's really worth bearing in mind, and again, without justifying Mugabe's actions, it's worth bearing in mind that in the 1980s, as I mentioned earlier, you had effectively 3 different military formations trying to come together. I mean, these are profound divisions. You had an ongoing situation of apartheid South Africa continuing to threaten and destabilize Zimbabwe's independence project. You had a war in Mozambique at the same time. And so this politics of security or insecurity feeds strong militaristic tendencies. You also have a state apparatus that has been geared towards a politics of control and of coercion, and serving as the kind of institutional model and apparatus that the new government inherited. And so I think that these things, these dynamics kind of fed into each other.
But let me just stop you there. In the case of Zimbabwe, you say there were 3 factors, and I agree. The white Rhodesian colonial state and its remnants, that, you know, one understands. Then there were 2 African liberation movements. Why couldn't the 2 African liberation movements, fighting for the same goals, more or less on the same principles, with virtually identical programs, either agree to coexist or unite and share power?
That's a very, again, vexed history. And I mean, I think that any African with any hope for liberating the continent would have wanted to see that kind of unity borne out. You know, we do have different characters with different aspirations and ambitions, different ideas about how they might run the country, and also different kinds of coalitions being formed. So ZANU and ZAPU drew external support from different sources.
ZAPU was Moscow, ZANU was Beijing.
That's correct.
So the Sino-Soviet dispute affected Zimbabwean politics.
Which is also itself part of these Cold War dynamics. Then there were the regional alliances. So there are multiple different formations that were taking place. And even within them, you know, ZANU and ZAPU are far less coherent than they might appear at surface value. What we see is, in fact, a much more complex and variegated picture of political infighting and aspiration that didn't quite cohere under this nationalist label.
Let me ask you a last question. Let us suppose that everything goes better than you think, and I think, and others think. There's economic gains, more investment, etc. A social safety net is reconstructed for the bulk of the population. What are the forces in the country that would compose or comprise, within the African majority, an opposition?
So I think that we're at a political moment where there's a lot of excitement about change in general, even though that change has happened really within ZANU-PF and not in the country writ large. I think that the opposition, in light of this, actually faces quite a steep challenge. Mnangagwa and the new government has a lot of momentum from having removed Mugabe from power, and a lot of sympathy amongst many Zimbabweans to sort of see what can these guys deliver.
Give them a chance.
Give them a chance. I think for the opposition, the biggest problem, in my view, that has shaped some of the internal politics of the opposition in Zimbabwe has been that it has defined itself too strongly by its opposition to Mugabe. Even the MDC's name, a Movement for Democratic Change, was about change from Mugabe and from ZANU-PF. Yet the MDC was made up by a disparate array of interests, many of which are quite incoherent. For instance, the interests of white capitalist farmers don't chime exactly with black trade unionists. So I think that the opposition would now need to re-articulate and reimagine that change and say that, okay, what is it? What kind of economic program? What kind of social program? What kind of political direction do we want to take the country in, as opposed to merely recovering from all of these years of crisis? So they don't really have the institutional coherence about them to have that conversation and mount a very strong challenge against the ruling party. Now, that may come with a newer, younger generation of aspirant politicians in Zimbabwe who are wanting to take the lessons from the past in a new direction, but I think that's something that remains to be seen.
Simukai Chigudu, thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.